Great, thanks so much. Welcome everybody again to Introducing Conversations about Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility to Personnel at a Mid-Sized Academic Library, brought to you by the ACRL University Library Section Professional Development Committee. We are delighted to have you and our presenters here today. I'm Andrea Wright, she, her. I'm a member of the committee. I'll be moderating this program today along with my colleague, Sam Harlow. This is one of an ongoing series of online programs sponsored by our committee, and we hope you'll take a chance to look at our guide to see some past programs and future ones. Before I introduce our presenters, I want to cover again just a few logistics. The session is now being recorded, and there will be links to the video, slides, and other supplemental documentation to everyone who is registered for the program. The program will run for 1 hour total, which includes time for questions. Please feel free to add questions into that chat box throughout the presentation at any time. Sam will be collating them and will be prepared to read them to today's presenters. As you use the chat feature, please make sure to send your message to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see what you're asking. We will also post a link to a brief evaluation in the chat box after the Q&A session. Please take a few moments to give us your feedback on today's program. With those announcements out of the way, I am very happy to start today's program, Introducing Conversations about Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility to Personnel at a Mid-Sized Academic Library. I'll briefly introduce our 4 presenters, and they can more fully introduce themselves as they see fit. Andrea Brooks, she, her, is the Pedagogy and Assessment Librarian at Northern Kentucky University and the former chair of the library's Inclusive Excellence Committee. She has long held roles relevant to teaching and leading information literacy efforts at her campus. Her research interests most recently include the application of critical and digital pedagogies to her teaching and assessing learning in ways that are grounded in student voices. Georgia Kneal, she, her, is the instructional designer for the College of Health and Human Services at NKU, and also serves as the chair of the staff of the Steely Library, and is a serving member of the Inclusive Excellence and Training and Engagement Committees. She's currently a graduate student in the pursuit of a master's in communication. Chrissy Ross, she, her, is the director of the Johnny May Berry Library at Cincinnati State Technical and Community College. She has worked in libraries for over 25 years in various roles and is passionate about open content, social justice, IDEA, information literacy, and access to higher education. Stephanie Korsland, she, her, is the senior instructional designer for the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Cincinnati. She has over a decade experience in working with teachers on the development and design of quality learning experiences. Her current research revolves around the intersection of instructional design and open education and creating accessible learning spaces online. And without further ado, I will hand it over to our wonderful panelist.
All right, thank you so much, Andrea, for that introduction. And thank you again to everybody who has signed on and is signing on as we speak. On behalf of my co-presenters, we are really excited to be here today to talk about a project on our campus last year where we introduced conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility among our colleagues. As Andrea mentioned, we are recording this. Our slides will be shared as well, so we have this information here. All right, so here's our plan for the next hour. I will briefly provide some overview, a brief overview and some context about how and why we brought this conversation series about. And I hope by sharing a little bit of our background information, then you might be able to adapt some of the elements to your own institutions. Then each of us will talk about how we facilitated our conversations. We each led a different group. So we'll talk about tips and techniques and some resources that we shared, and then you may be able to apply some of that as well. And then we also at the end will talk about how we are moving these conversations into actions. And of course, this is ongoing work and it's by no means done, but hopefully you can start to think about how conversations can turn into action steps. So when my colleagues and I were thinking about whether or not to present this topic, we had a lot of conversations, and it was really important to us that we acknowledge our perspectives and experiences. So we put this disclaimer in our slides here. We are cis white women from the United States. We have not experienced the types of bias that affect those from marginalized backgrounds related to race, cultural background, and sexual orientation. We acknowledge this conversation and topics are very complex. There may be cases where our work betrays our lack of experience with these topics. If there is any part of this conversation that you find to be one-sided or dismissive of any aspect of your identity, please contact us. We really do welcome comments, feedback that can improve our work and help inform our own understanding of this topic. So this is us. Hello. You have our contact information there. We will share this slide at the end as well, so you have the contact information again. And we do have time built in at the end for question and answer. A couple of things I will say. So Andrea gave a wonderful introduction to each of us, but two things I want to point out. So when we took on this project, all of us were at Northern Kentucky University. Since that time, two of my colleagues, Stephanie and Chrissy, have crossed the Ohio River and gone to the Cincinnati side. So we're really grateful and thankful that they came back today and they're willing to share the experiences that they engaged with last year with us. And then the second thing I want to point out is our library, our organization includes the university's instructional designers. So that might be unique for some libraries. I think some libraries have that, some don't. So I just wanted to be clear about instructional designers and our context are part of this larger library umbrella. All right, so we have a quick poll first. We want to know some of the experiences from all of you. So let me go ahead and launch this. We are curious if your organization has facilitated formally structured inclusion, diversity, equity, or accessibility conversations or discussions among personnel. All right, I'll give it a few more seconds as folks respond. Okay. All right, so this is interesting. I am going, oh, people are still responding. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. You can get a pretty general sense of where our attendees, what experiences our attendees have had. So wonderful. More than half of you have, in fact, facilitated some type of conversation or discussion among your personnel. 18% of you have not, another about 20% have not, but are thinking about doing something. So that's awesome, welcome. And some of you aren't sure. So that's great to get a sense of who is here. So whether you have engaged in these conversations or not, I hope you find some of this useful and applicable. All right, so I told you I would give you a little bit of background information. So this project was in spring of 2021, so 2 spring semesters ago. And at the beginning of that semester, back in January, our university issued or mandated a university-wide inclusive training, diversity, equity, and inclusion training. It was an online modules, all faculty, staff, and I believe even students had to engage in this training. And the modules, they contained different topics, things like power, privilege, communication, thinking about how our communication is perceived by others. Microaggressions was a topic as well. At the same time that this university-wide training was rolled out, we have an inclusive excellence committee within the library. And we've had this committee in the library for several years. But at this time, the committee was talking about what actions can we start to put into place, kind of thinking about some new planning for actions. We were thinking, is our library the most welcoming space that it could be? How can we enhance the diversity of our collections and diverse perspectives within our collections? And within the Inclusive Excellence Committee, we were having some of these conversations and then also doing these university-wide inclusive training. And we started to wonder, are other people in the library also engaging in these conversations? And we felt like maybe that wasn't happening because there wasn't really an outlet to do so. And so that's where the idea for these conversations was born. We thought we had this opportunity where everyone has to engage in this training. Maybe we can all come together and talk about it and put it in the context of the library. And what does it mean for our everyday work? So we formed 4 groups. We invited all of our colleagues to join a group. It was not required. Just if you wanted to join a group, you could. And we formed 4 groups. The first one was around leadership and hiring. The second one, combined customer service and spaces. The third group was around teaching. And the fourth group was around collections. And then we bookended this series with a presentation from our Chief Diversity Officer on our campus, where he came at the end of the semester and gave a library-wide presentation about how he saw the library, excuse me, fitting in with the university's larger strategic goals related to student success and equity, diversity, and inclusion. And one other thing I want to point out too is this was spring of 21, so this all happened online. All of this was set up through Zoom. So we met, all these conversations occurred via Zoom. So we had 22 participants sign up for one of the groups, and it was pretty evenly spread out amongst the 4 groups, plus the 4 facilitators. So really it was 26. So we had more than half of the library personnel participate. Each group, we met 3 times across a 3 or 4 week time span, so roughly once a week. And then each group had a facilitator. And one of the things as facilitators, we really emphasized, we volunteered to do this, but we really emphasized that we were not experts. And I know I personally even was a little bit nervous about facilitating one of these groups. I didn't feel like I knew enough. But I will say each group, you need a facilitator, right? You need somebody to to organize the meeting, set up the Zoom links. So there's that administrative aspect of it. But as facilitators, we did a few other things as well. We collected and we shared readings and videos that we shared ahead of time. We offered prompts during the conversation groups to kind of keep the conversations going. And we were also in charge of maintaining a list of action items. So as the groups were conversing and somebody said, oh, we should do this, we made a list and we kept a list of all of these things. So each of the groups, as facilitators, we all facilitated them a little bit differently, which you'll hear about here in a few minutes. But we did share 2 overarching goals. One was we wanted to deepen the understanding of equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility within the library context, depending on which group folks chose. And then the second thing we wanted to do is, while understanding is important and talking, I think has a lot of value, we also wanted to move some of that to actions. And as groups think about short-term or long-term actions that we might put into place. So this could be things like creating a new policy, increasing access to diverse perspectives, or even things like sustaining inclusive practices that were already in place. And then finally, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit, but as facilitators, we did meet a few times before we launched our conversations and also within the broader inclusive excellence group. And we did talk a lot about, should we do this? As we mentioned, we are 4 white women. We're in a predominantly white library. We're in a predominantly white profession, right? So we really struggled, do we know enough to have these conversations? We had conversations about, is there value in having these conversations if we don't have a racially diverse staff to start with? We all felt some levels of uncomfortableness in doing this. I think we have all been, the 4 of us perhaps had been privileged in the past to not really think about these topics or really to look inward at how whiteness has influenced or is reflected in our libraries. I really like this quote from Robin DiAngelo, though, where she says, we've got to start making it uncomfortable and figuring out what supports we're going to put in place to help us continue to be uncomfortable, because the forces of comfort are quite seductive. And that really resonates with me. It would have been easy to not do these conversations. It was comfortable, right, to not talk about it. But I think we all agreed silence wasn't the answer. And also, I think not having a racially diverse staff is a really terrible excuse to not have these conversations. So with that, we did launch the conversations, and I'm going to turn things over to Georgia, who is going to talk about her experience facilitating the teaching group.
Thank you, Andrea. Okay. We could go to the next slide, please. So I was the facilitator of the teaching group, and it was a mix of upper administration, faculty, and staff. There were prompts and resources that mainly focused on teaching and students in the classroom. At the beginning of each meeting, I would let the group know that it was a safe space. There was no reason for these groups discussions. The reason for these group discussions as a facilitator is that I'd be prompting and building upon each person's answers. So I kind of let the conversations kind of move in a natural way. And some of the conversation would move off topic. I did not try to re-steer the group in any way though. Each week I had a different topic and prompt with a resource article. In our first meeting, it was inclusion with our teaching documents. And the prompt that I gave the group was, how can we make our syllabus, lecture materials, and other documentation inclusive? With the second week, I talked about accessibility in teaching. What are the steps that we can take to make our courses all accessible to all? And then the third meeting, after building upon the first, second, and now the third, was teaching spaces. And I basically prompted with, how can we make the online teaching space have the same feeling and inclusiveness as an in-person learning? There was a bit of nervousness as a leader of the group, and there was also actually some pushback from individuals in the group from the first meeting. I did turn to my other facilitators for guidance. So at the second meeting with the teaching group, I did a gentle reminder that this is a voluntary and no one is obligated to continue. And if they did not want to, they could leave. It was very interesting with the participants in the group. Some were very vocal, expressed a lot of opinions and thoughts, and others did not talk very much, were very much observant. At our second meeting, we had one participant who actually emailed with a resource. And that was actually kind of nice because to see participation outside of the group and within the time that we met. Next slide, please. With the final meeting as a group, we actually did come up with some action items that could possibly be turned into actions the library could actually implement. The following is what the group came up with. Having badges, creating a badge system for personnel who completed a course in accessibility and inclusion, kind of like a LinkedIn certification. Templates for alternative assignments, creating a template bank for faculty to have and use for students who need accommodations. Also, boilerplates, partner with the Office of Student Accessibility to create learning materials that would be needed for students with accommodations. And then finally, the final action was usability surveys. Send out a survey to the students in regards to the usability of the courses and how accessible they really are. Thank you. I will pass it over now to Stephanie.
Thanks, Georgia. So of the four of us, I was the only one who was not on the Inclusive Excellence Committee to start. So I had agreed to facilitate these conversations because I wanted to see more done with DEI in my workplace. I've seen people not take this kind of mandatory computer module training seriously, talking more about how quickly they can get the training done and really ignoring why we even do this type of training in the first place. So for me, participating in and facilitating these conversations was a way to actively engage people in dialogue around these topics and examine what steps we could all take to create a more equitable and inclusive workplace. So the goal for me was really, like we've all been saying, to move us from conversation to action. Now, before we even started, I wanted to make sure that as a facilitator, I would create a safe space for our difficult discussions. I began by acknowledging that there may be possible discomfort when, discussing topics around DEI for those in the group, and that the feelings that they may have were valid. I acknowledged that the space that we were created was for open dialogue, and that everyone was welcome to contribute to the conversation, but they by no means were required to contribute. And because these were, more difficult discussion topics, I wanted to make sure that people knew that we wouldn't be recording the sessions. They weren't required to have their cameras on. As Andrea said, we're all on Zoom. The space was really meant to be a place where people could share and discuss and learn from one another. So when it came to actually facilitating the discussions, in our initial discussion in my group, it was a broader discussion on the themes related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, with our second discussion narrowing in more on the same themes as the first week, but through a customer service lens. In particular, one major area that we focused on in our second discussion was around the topic of microaggressions in customer service. And the second article here on my slide, Keeping Up with Microaggressions, really helped us along with that discussion. Now, while I asked everyone in our first session to introduce themselves at the beginning of the first meeting and talk about what motivated them to join the sessions and what they hope to get out of our session, no one was ever forced into speaking or sharing if they didn't want to. And while I had provided some material before our discussions, I never said, it was never a requirement that we stick to just those topics. I really felt like I was the facilitator, and as the facilitator, I wanted to make sure everyone knew that this was a space where anyone could contribute to the conversation or bring their own topics for discussion. After the first time we met, I invited others to share resources as well. And when they did share resources, I made sure to share those out to the rest of the group before the next time that we met so that we could talk about them in our next discussion. Our final discussion was really all about brainstorming ideas and looking at what we could actually do. And what we ended up doing is our ideas kind of fell into three sort of categories. The first category I sort of labeled as think big, that if there was nothing stopping us from doing anything, what would we like to see or do or see changed? The second category that we had were these suggestions for the near future. These ideas were things that had no or little cost to them that we wanted to see implemented that would impact not just us in the library, but the larger campus community as well. And then finally, our third sort of category of ideas were ideas for us as individuals. These were things that we could each individually implement where appropriate in the work that we were already doing. And this is really where we get at that question of what action can we take now in our everyday work. Next slide, Andrea. So here we have just a few things that came out of our brainstorming session. And the first one, like create inclusive spaces that support a variety of students and needs. This really covers a lot of different aspects. We talked about like, are there ways that we can create additional spaces that are inclusive inside the library? Also taking a look at our already existing spaces and finding ways to maybe make them more accessible to our campus community. Our second idea is looking at developing a chat script to ensure consistent and positive inclusive language. Our librarians would connect with some customers online, and we wanted to make sure that we were consistent and inclusive in the way that we were reaching out to our customers. We also talked about creating a Canvas course for our student workers, because while they had DEI in a training, they did not, I don't think they had the exact sort of training that we as full-time staff and faculty at the library. And so we wanted to make sure that as workers of the library, they were, that their training included the sorts of things that we wanted to make sure to include, this DEI and A in customer service. All right, Chrissy.
Thanks, Stephanie. Much like Georgia and Stephanie's groups, it was my intention with the collections conversations to let it build and direct itself. Before every meeting, I would email the group suggested prompts or resources to inspire conversation. This pre-meeting message would also include a civility disclaimer, emphasizing respect, active listening, and safe space. I would also ask the group to bring their own topics of discussion if they wished. Throughout the meetings, I reminded our group that our end goal was to create actionable items out of these conversations. The conversations are incredibly important, but it was equally important to identify actionable steps we could begin to take. Our conversations were very informative, and we had significant inspiration from the news and current events during that time. There was backlash happening in the library community related to Dr. Seuss and book content, which turned into a source for our conversations and discussions about our related library responsibilities. One of my favorite resources for our group, and I'm sure a lot of you in this group have watched this already, was the Change the Subject documentary Out of Darkness. If you have not watched it, I highly recommend that you do. This is actually a perfect resource as it gets to the core of collections, community perceptions of library processes, and the language we explicitly choose and use to describe our collections. We must continually evaluate the words we choose. Are they user-centered and user-friendly? Are they diverse and inclusive? Even more important and alarming, are the words we are choosing to use highly offensive? These are important conversations to repeatedly have inside the library. I'm sure to no one's surprise, social media outlets provide an endless flow of inspiration for our group conversations. Related to diversifying collection content and also interesting progress being made in connected communities. At the time, Amazon was removing resources from its platform that described LGBTQIA+ issues as disorders. This led to interesting conversations about removing resources from library collections, which, unlike Amazon, are not private corporations, of course, but resources that are medically outdated or worse, offensively incorrect. What are our responsibilities there? Also, how our core obligation to our university curriculum played into these scenarios and what our decision processes looked like related to these relationships. Was the process accurate and efficient? Was it inclusive and diverse? We talked about collection evolutions from a historical perspective. For instance, is it necessary to keep outdated resources through the lens of research, meaning for researchers looking at the evolution of ideas and history through library collections? Or is that detrimental to the cause of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility? These are difficult conversations to have, and it was helpful and important to recognize we all may get stuck in bubbles sometimes, thinking our colleagues, who we all enjoy working with so much, may also have the same perspectives as our own. These conversations illustrated the opposite of that. Many of our colleagues have valid opinions on these complex matters that are different than our own, and these informal conversations were helpful for understanding their perspectives. Many times, it was something I had not previously considered myself. Bottom line, it was worth having these discussions to identify our core and collective values as a library unit, and to then work to align our decision-making processes with those identified values. Of course, it's very important to recognize these conversations are very difficult for our colleagues in the groups who are affected directly and personally by other colleagues' words and ideas. So be sensitive of that and intentional of building a safe space when organizing, planning, and facilitating the conversations. Always work intentionally to provide a safe and inclusive space for all of your colleagues in these groups and in general, I would suggest. I made sure to reach out to group members informally and one-on-one to check in and solicit feedback throughout the entire series of conversations. I actually received fantastic feedback from one of our colleagues, making a point I hadn't considered previously. As noted, these conversations happened during the pandemic when we were remote. This modality played a significantly beneficial role in our conversations as it provided space between participants to distance themselves from emotionally charged conversations if they needed to. Participants could dip out of the meeting or turn off their cameras if they needed to. I'm curious if the conversations had happened face-to-face, if we would have had the same success in authentic conversations. In this scenario, our remote setup was highly beneficial. Next slide, please. So we proposed many action ideas. These are only a few of them. This is one reason it was wonderful to have a diverse conversation group. We had an archivist in our group, catalogers, interlibrary loan folk, acquisitions, e-reserves, and an instructional designer in our group. This type of diverse working group had never really assembled in the past, specifically to think about how all of our workflows connect. For instance, our instructional designer was focused on content that is accessible, and rightfully so. So understanding the emphasis on that important quality was helpful for all of us, but specifically for our interlibrary loan and e-reserve processes. Evaluating those workflows to ensure we were delivering content to our courses, our students and our faculty that met accessibility standards. Also, coming together as a diverse group to talk about our obligation to the curriculum of the university, how we could strengthen that understanding internally and externally, and defining that work process a little more clearly inside the library was incredibly beneficial. Overall, this was an extremely rewarding experience. These conversations are difficult work. I don't want to act like they are not, but imperative for forward progress at the library and for maintaining current awareness of important ideas inside the library. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Andrea.
All right, thanks, Chrissy. So I facilitated the group on leadership and hiring. And as I was thinking about structuring these conversations, I was really attracted to the idea of appreciative inquiry. So appreciative inquiry is, I believe it's actually a useful approach to use for things like strategic planning, but it can be useful anytime you're working to generate ideas. And the idea is that rather than focus on what hasn't worked, you think about what you have done well and what experiences have been positive so that you can build on that foundation to create something even better. And I use the steps of appreciative inquiry to loosely structure our meetings. So the first meeting is really about discovering where have we seen inclusive leadership traits? Where have you seen them? This was a prompt I provided to my group. What does it look like when power is used for good? And can you share examples of that? In the second meeting, then we build on that and we start to think about, sky is the limit. What are some possibilities? What are some things that we would love to implement? We don't need to think about budget in this meeting, just brainstorming general ideas. And then in the third meeting, the idea was that we would hone in on specific actions. And as my colleagues have talked about, that third meeting was thinking even more specifically about what is short-term, what is long-term, what are some actual things that are practical that we could implement. And I will say that this whole structure really did blur together. So in my mind, I kind of thought it would go in this exact order, but of course it did blur. And so we didn't exactly follow this structure. But I did share out a video, and I will put it in the chat link here in a little bit. It's a YouTube video. It's maybe 2 or 3 minutes about appreciative inquiry. And I shared that with my conversation group before our first meeting, and I invited them to engage in this type of dialogue where we appreciate each other. So something else I did before every meeting, like my colleagues, I shared out some resources. I also invited others to share resources as well, particularly after that first and second meeting. I also would share the prompts ahead of time, or at least to some extent, I would share a couple of prompts so that the individuals within the group could think about and kind of individually reflect on some of these ideas before coming to the conversation group. And so in the first meeting, the very first thing I did actually was I acknowledged the uncomfortableness. We had some interesting power dynamics in that we had upper level administrators and we had folks who didn't supervise anybody because leadership, right, can show up in all roles. So, I wanted it to be as safe of a space as it could be, recognizing that there were these power dynamics in play. And so I invited everyone to, embrace as much as you could being uncomfortable and acknowledge that we all felt a level of it. And then I asked everyone to talk about their roles within the library. We all knew each other, but we didn't necessarily know the intricate details of what everyone's work entails. And if they were comfortable, I asked everyone to talk a little bit about how they already felt some IDE and A work might connect with some of their library work. And if they didn't know or they weren't sure, that was fine too, right? We were all there to kind of talk and work through some of this together. So that first meeting, we did some of that initial introductions, kind of getting to know each other. And through our conversations and those initial prompts, we really started to hone in less on hiring and more about retention of employees. We talked a lot about, it's great to hire new folks, but how do we ensure that we have this environment that really allows everyone to see themselves as a part of it? And we talked a lot about creating a sense of belonging and what our role as leaders is to contribute to that. So then that led us into our second meeting, where we, again, still really we talked about hiring strategies, but we also talked about retention quite a bit. And I had shared a resource. It's the second one that I have linked there. It's from April Hathcock, where she talks about diversity residencies. And that was really interesting to think about diversity residencies from different perspectives and the value, but then also some of the concerns with residencies. And just we hadn't considered some of those perspectives. And then our third meeting is when we really started to hone in on specific action items. I had one member of our group who really embraced the appreciative inquiry and just wanted to celebrate us all the time. And so we talked a lot about what can we do to celebrate each other and recognize each other. So this meeting, we reflected back quite a bit on our past discussions, of course. And I also put a link in there, a resource that we had found. And I don't think I had found it. I think someone else from my group had found it. But it was from the University of Washington, where they talk about best practices for faculty searches. And so we talked about that a little bit, particularly the idea of writing diversity statements and the value or concerns even with having folks submit diversity statements. So there was some good conversation around that. And as my colleagues did, I have some action items here. There was a much longer list, and we're going to talk in a few minutes a little bit more about where action ideas have gone since this time, but these were some kind of big ideas we talked about. And some of these things like implicit bias training and using scoring rubrics, these were things that we were already doing, but we talked about them as a group, and I think it helped build some awareness about why we were doing it. So I still think there's some value in that. We have done some things with our mentoring program. We had a mentoring program, but we have been working to improve it for new folks when they come in. This last year, we had more library events that were showcasing diverse authors. And then I didn't include this on the slide, but we did end up joining the ACRL Diversity Alliance, our library did. And maybe we would have done that without having this conversation, but I think by having the conversation with this group, it helped all of us kind of have awareness for the Alliance, but then also an understanding of why we did join that group. And I think this is Georgia.
Thank you, Andrea. So after the conclusion of the conversations, we sent out a feedback survey to our participants. One of our goals of these conversations was to increase our understanding. Over half the participants completed the survey. The majority of who completed the survey did get something out of these conversations, even if it's with a moderate amount gained. It's a success. Next slide, please. The conversations, when asked, the majority of the respondents would say yes, they would have and attend the same conversations the following year. Next slide, please. About 1/3 of our participants responded to the open-ended questions. We did ask about personal actions that they may take. And as you can see, not all were sure, but it did create an awareness and inspired them to view their work through a different lens. Next slide, please. And here is a timeline of events that brought us to the action that was taken by the Steely Library Inclusive Excellence Committee this past spring of 2022. We started with the conversations in the aforementioned slides in the spring of 2021. Then in the fall of 2021, there was a call for proposals, which brought us to the spring of 2022. Next slide, please. As one of the continued members of the Inclusive Excellence Committee for the Steely Library, the call for proposals came out of the conversations. There were 3 proposals submitted, and the one that was chosen was the DEI Pedagogy Book Collection. The goal for this collection is to potentially to have a potential electronic resource on subjects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It can include both foundations texts, but also more recent books that reflect the current state of the field. These books should be sourced by a diverse group of instructors, staff members, in order to ensure that the bias is minimized and prioritizing resources. The collection of these books should be set apart from the regular stacks to give it some degree of prominence. There was a budget of $400. The selection and purchase of the collection would be 10 to 15 books to share with the university. There's some things that came out of scope of the proposal, which was a speaking series. But the proposal was also brought to the director of the Office of Inclusive Excellence and the Provost Office of NKU, which they both agreed to match the offer of the budget of $400 with the possibility of a speaker of one of the books, with a grand total of $1,200 and a speaker. So great action there that took from these conversations. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Georgia. So overall, I think that we would all agree we had a wonderful experience with these conversations. They were enlightening and very productive. They provide great opportunity for library-specific awareness and active and ongoing conversations, and they complemented our mandatory DEI university training perfectly and in good time. And as one of our participants noted, the more we have these talks, the easier they will become. Of course, there are things that we'd consider improving or reevaluating in the future. Our groups were volunteers, and we were very lucky to have a healthy response of volunteers from many different library roles. In the future, we might consider the makeup of each small group more specifically. Is it beneficial to have representation from around the library in the groups, or should they be more job related? How might the conversations have played out if we mandated all employees attend? Would people have been as active? We recognize these conversations are important for everyone at the library, but volunteers and volunteer facilitators may feel more comfortable starting out with enthusiastic volunteers and building from there for the next conversations. The size of the groups is a topic for evaluation as well. Small groups may be a barrier for diversity or shrink odds for active participation. Larger groups can provide for more diverse idea exchange, but too large, voices could be lost or include unintended power dynamics. Facilitator selection is key. Ours were volunteer, but how would the conversations have played out if we had to select facilitators? Facilitators must be passionate, knowledgeable, and very important, able to keep the conversation safe and moving forward towards action. This work takes a lot of time and emotional labor to be successful. So we would suggest respecting that and giving it the resources it demands and deserves. Next slide, please. So thanks so much for listening to our presentation today. We're very excited to open up the floor to you guys, our audience. I do recall the poll. It looked like about half of the participants here have had these conversations and half had not. So we might be interested as panelists here, hearing some questions from the audience, of course, but also maybe what are some of the barriers you're having to moving forward at your own institutions.
Okay, this is Sam. I'm going to start with the first question that came in based on timeline. So with respect to collections, you mentioned the question of whether to continue holding materials that may now be offensive and sensitive, seeing as they may provide historical perspective, evolution of ideas. What did you end up deciding on whether to retain these materials or not? Or did you take it on a case-by-case basis?
Going right for the gusto there. That's an excellent question and an important one, right? I think the conversation kind of turned into our obligation to the curriculum of the university also, right? So it's not even just about maybe what's held at the library, but also the faculty on our campus and the resources they needed for their courses. So, and also the mission and values of our own library, right? Are we a large library that's holding on to content, or are we just collecting items that are in the now and current, and it is not, our responsibility as the library to hold on to these huge collections? I would say that's an ongoing conversation, and I would say that our collections physically and electronically have transformed very quickly in a short amount of time to being more not historical in nature, but deeply tied to the curriculum of the university. So I hope that answers that question.
Okay, next question. Sorry, I'm navigating back and forth. Does anyone use DEI statements inside the out-of-date books that make it clear why the book was retained?
Do you want to speak to that, Chrissy? I don't know if that's something your group talked about, or.
That is a great suggestion, and it's not something that we have talked about. And I think that's very interesting, and we need to add it to our action item list. I think that's a great idea, so that when people do come in and maybe see something that they would think is offensive, what is the reasoning that the library has decided to keep that as a great idea. Yeah, but we don't, and of course I've left NKU since these conversations started, but we were not in the practice of doing that. And I do have to say, we were in the process of really transforming our physical collection. So a lot of it has moved on. So, but that's a great idea.
So leadership and hiring focus group, was there a consensus from the group that retention was an ongoing issue in the library?
Yes, and I don't think it was just within our library. I think our university as a whole is grappling with this, and my understanding, even just higher education in general. And we were in the process, and we have recently hired a few new folks who have joined us. And so I think I was chairing a search committee at the time. So perhaps this was more on our mind for that reason, because we wanted to be sure that we had an inviting space for new folks. We had a lot of folks who have worked in the library, myself included, for a very long time. And so, it was certainly something we were interested in thinking about. How can we retain folks as we bring them in? Did that answer the question?
So the next question, I'm just going to keep going because they're coming in. Respecting the diversity statements, can you share some resources you found useful?
Yeah, I think the University of Washington website, and I can put that in the chat perhaps, or you have we'll share the slide link and it's in there. I believe they have a link in there for diversity statements, and that's what we had primarily used. But I think ALA also and ACRL maybe have some resources as well, if I recall.
Okay, I was grabbing the slide link. Next question. What accessibility changes did you make to hiring or would like to make? Personally, I have some strong opinions on what seems to be the higher ed standard of multi-day, 6+ hour interviews, having to prepare work presentations without pay, etc. I think some libraries, in the quest to find good candidates, are actually creating an inaccessible interview space, especially for marginalized groups.
So great question. Not something we talked about during that specific conversation group. However, we have since started to have some of these conversations. And I don't think it's just us either. This is clearly a topic elsewhere. But yeah, I don't have, within our institution, we haven't instituted anything specific. I will say during hiring, when we were hiring a few positions during the pandemic, kind of the height of the pandemic, we did talk a lot about, we didn't want to put folks on Zoom all day. That seemed like, it would be really tough on everybody. So we did talk about strategies to minimize Zoom fatigue. And so we split interviews up. Instead of one day, we did like 2 different days in chunks. So that's what we've done so far. Now we're back in person now. And we haven't taken any actions at this time, but I would love to see that as well.
I'm going to throw one other answer to that in there, Andrea. And I think, so since we had these conversations, I myself was also on a search committee, and we were kind of having a conversation about interview questions and having access to those prior to the interview. And was that helpful, and what that meant, or should they be held for the interview, right? And it was nice because I'd kind of been through these conversations and talked to a lot of people, like understanding like access to those questions was a DEIA issue, right? So being just that person on the search committee to say, hey, we should make these accessible, was just part of these conversations. So, and I think when we have these big groups of people where we do have informal conversations, they then go out and they're on these committees, and they have this inspiration from the committees to contribute to the campus community in these types of committees. So I think that's another benefit of it's a slow process that we are trying to make a change with, and sending people out to committees that have been through the process I think is beneficial to everybody.
So the next question is, what could be done in LIS education to prepare students and facilitate these important conversations in the workplace?
I love that question. And I know that one of our action items in our group was specific to collections was NKU, if you guys don't know, actually has an undergraduate library informatics program. So we have undergraduate library students that our faculty teach and work on projects through the year. And one of our action items was to think about how we can involve our library students in the evaluation of our collection and understanding subject headings and that kind of stuff as part of their coursework. So I think, a lot of that is just awareness and education, the outreach. We're lucky in our library to have access to library students and graduate students and trying to work to make sure they're involved in this very important diversity work. So.
And I will just to build on that, I think I definitely, and I think it is to a certain extent, you're seeing it more, DEI and A kind of topics being embedded into the curriculum because, and I think this is what the question was getting at, is if we can start talking about this more, it becomes less uncomfortable, and perhaps we build more confidence in talking about it. Because I know we all felt nervous about it. We hadn't had a lot of experience facilitating groups on this topic. And so the earlier you can start those conversations, particularly in the library context, I think the better.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that these conversations should be core at the bottom of any planning anywhere, right? So in your work and new projects, so really getting folks and maybe library students to understand that the diversity angle of any plan related to anything on campus should fundamentally be about DEI accessibility, right? So getting it in at the core, which I think may be a new, not new, but a new way of thought for some people.
So I'm going to try to combine two questions here. So someone asked, in these conversations, were any facilitators people of color, library staff members? And then to skip to a question that might be able to kind of be combined, what advice would you give in providing diversity training to student workers?
This is a great question about the representation on our staff. And I know that it's something that we struggle with. We are predominantly white staff at our library, and in no way want to speak for our colleagues that are not white. So, and that was a very difficult conversation for us to have and to think about how we could move forward, because really when it came down to it, and I know Andrea talked about this kind of in the beginning, it was either try to do something or do nothing, right? So that is why we kind of move forward with everything, but it was a difficult decision for us. It's difficult for us even to submit our proposal for this webinar, right? Because we understand the optics of that and what it looks like. And that was not our intention. And while we are very a majority of white staff at our library. We do have a few people that were in the groups to share in the conversations with us, but that's a difficult question to answer, I think, but yes.
I can chime in about the, I agree with what you said, Chrissy, but, and I can chime in about the students as well. So I think, and I was trying to remember this actually, I think we did talk about it. We did not include student workers in our conversation groups. But as we were reflecting back on this and preparing for this presentation, I was kind of wondering, why didn't we? And I don't know if we talked about it and then we decided not to, or if there wasn't interest. But I think it would be awesome if we did this again and somehow engaged with our student employees. I think that would be a really cool thing. And some of our student employees actually are library informatics students, the program that Chrissy was talking about. So that would be really great.
So there's a lot of questions about, not a lot, but I mean like 3 or 4 questions about assessment, like thinking through how you assess these kind of initiatives after facilitating these conversations. So yeah, assessment tools. And then the next question, to be fair to the timing, was regarding barriers. Any suggestions for how to navigate an environment where colleagues have misguided understanding of disability accessibility fundamentals, but are the ones who are currently conducting the IDEA initiatives?
I can speak to the assessment question. And Georgia had a couple of slides where we did do a survey with our participants trying to gauge what ideas folks took from it. I forget the exact wording of the questions, but, if we did this again, would you attend? And, overall, participants seem to take at least an increased awareness away. And so I see that as a positive and took away some ideas. And then also, as far as assessment, we have this project going on now where the library is funding action ideas. So we can submit proposals and then those proposals may be funded. And so that is, I hope, continuing on. So we've just funded the first proposal, but it should not, and I'm sure it's not the end of that work, and will continue on. And the Inclusive Excellence Committee has maintained this action list idea. And some things are a little easier to implement than others, may not even require as much funding, but so that's how our assessment, I guess, how we took it on.
And just to kind of add to that, as the continued member of the Inclusive Excellence Committee, there are more actions that are being planned for the following year. So there's more action items that we are definitely tackling and taking on. And it's definitely going to be a continued process and continued work.
And I think there was a second question, something.
I'll just repeat it real fast and it will be the last minute of regarding barriers, any suggestions for how to navigate an environment where colleagues have misguided understandings of disability accessibility fundamentals, but are the ones who are currently conducting the IDEA initiatives?
I think that's a $1 million question, right? Kind of this idea spread and gathering support and team building. And that's kind of, I think, the idea of what these conversations were supposed to be, right? Like we're kind of getting together. This is an informal conversation where everybody is safe, right? But we're also safe to hear other ideas and think about how those ideas integrate into our own work. And I have to say, we were really lucky. Both of our instructional designers are very knowledgeable and expert in kind of those accessibility ideas and how we should be integrating them. So that was kind of the foundation of these conversations, was to share ideas, spread ideas, build expertise and knowledge, and talk openly and safely with each other. And that took a lot of active listening and civility disclaimers and that type of thing. So the core of the process there is how to have these conversations and move them forward, right? And win people over. So it's in progress.
And maybe as we're wrapping up, because I think we're right on the hour, as Andrea is going to read our final script. I left the questions that we didn't have time for. Y'all are welcome to address those in the slides that we will share in the recording. And I also collected all of the comments and the links that were shared in the chat when people were kind of asking the group questions, if I could find them. So yeah.
Yes, so thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing your experience with us today. I would also like to thank Gina Parsons Diamond and everyone else at the ACRL office who always help make the magic happen with these presentations. Do remember, for participants, we will send a link to the recording and other documents and slides when it becomes available. And a last request, if you would consider filling out our brief evaluation form that's in the chat window, we appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for coming today.